Hey everyone, and welcome back for another deep dive with us. Today we're going to be tackling something that I think is super relevant to everybody listening, the psychology of money. We're going to be looking at this awesome episode from the Curious Rays podcast called The Psychology of Money, Why Smart People Make Dumb Money Decisions. And they're kind of riffing on this book by Morgan Housel called The Psychology of Money. But don't worry, we're not going to get into like crazy investment strategies or anything like that. It's really about the mental and emotional side of money, which like we don't always talk about, but it impacts literally every financial decision that we make.
Oh, absolutely.
Huh?
It's funny because, we always think about money as this like purely rational thing, numbers and logic.
Mhm.
But the reality is our emotions play a huge role in how we handle money.
Totally. I mean, think about it. Have you ever like bought something and then later you were like, ugh, why did I do that? Just because you're like caught up in the moment.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Happens to the best of us. And the Curious Rays hosts, they make this really interesting point right at the beginning. They say that like making money might be about knowledge, but keeping it is all about behavior.
Ooh, that's a good one. Do you think that holds true for like everyone? Or are there exceptions?
I think there's a lot of truth to it. Like, think about it this way. You could have all the knowledge in the world about investing, but if you panic and sell everything when the market dips, that knowledge isn't really going to help you.
Yeah, that's true. So it's not just what we know, but how we like react and behave when it comes to money.
Exactly. And one of the first things that the podcast dives into is this idea of luck and risk. And they tell this really compelling story about Bill Gates.
Yeah.
Obviously, he's one of the most successful entrepreneurs ever. But they point out that he had some incredible luck along the way.
Oh, like what?
Well, for one thing, he happened to attend one of the very few schools in the 1960s that had access to a computer. And so that early exposure really gave him a massive head start.
Wow, I've never thought about it that way. So even someone as brilliant as Bill Gates needed a little luck to kind of get to where he is.
Makes you wonder, right? And it's not to say that hard work and talent don't matter, but it just highlights that luck plays a bigger role than we sometimes like to admit.
So then where does that leave us? If luck is such a big factor, does that mean that we're all just at the mercy of fate?
Well, the podcast actually offers a really helpful way to think about this. They say we should stay humble when we win and be kind to ourselves when we fail.
I like that. It's acknowledging that luck exists, good and bad, but it doesn't mean we're powerless.
Exactly. We still have control over our choices and how we respond to things, but recognizing the role of chance can help us have a more balanced perspective.
Yeah, it's like celebrate your wins, but don't let them go to your head. And if things don't go your way, don't beat yourself up too much. There might have been factors outside of your control.
Right on. And no, this idea of acknowledging luck, it actually ties in closely with another key concept the podcast explores, which is this idea of enough.
Okay, what do they mean by that?
Well, they talk about how so many of us, especially in today's society, we're constantly striving for more money, more possessions, more status. It's like we're on this never-ending treadmill, always chasing the next thing.
Oh, yeah, I totally feel that sometimes. Like seeing everyone on social media and they're like highlight reels. And you're just like, oh, I need that too.
It's so easy to fall into that trap. The podcast tells this cautionary tale about this hedge fund billionaire who, despite having like unimaginable wealth, he just kept pushing for more. And he ended up making some really bad decisions that landed him in trouble.
Wow. So even having more than enough doesn't guarantee happiness or even protect you from making bad choices.
Right. It's a good reminder. They use this analogy. It's like going to an all-you-can-eat buffet
Yeah.
and feeling like you have to keep eating even though you're like completely stuffed.
Ooh, that's a good one. We think we need to keep taking more, but at some point it stops being enjoyable. And it even becomes harmful. So then how do we figure out what enough actually means for us? It seems so personal.
It is deeply personal.
Yeah.
And there's no like magic formula. But the podcast suggests that a good place to start is by asking ourselves, what truly brings us joy and fulfillment? Is it constantly chasing more? Or is it something simpler, more intrinsic?
Yeah, that's a really important question for all of us to consider. I'm curious, have you ever reached a point where you felt like you had enough? Or are you still figuring that out?
That's a great question. And to be honest, it's something that I'm constantly evaluating. I think for a lot of us, the idea of enough shifts over time as our priorities and values change.
Yeah, it's like a moving target almost. But maybe that's okay. Maybe it's not about finding some fixed point, but just like being aware of what truly matters to us at each stage of our lives. And speaking of things that matter, the podcast also talks about this whole idea of compounding,
No.
which is often hailed as like the eighth wonder of the world, and for good reason.
Right, this incredible force that can really supercharge your wealth-building journey.
So for those who might not be familiar, can you break down like what compounding actually is?
Sure. So it's basically the idea of earning interest on your interest. So let's say you invest $100 and it earns 10% interest. The next year, you'll have $110. But here's the cool part. The following year, you're not just earning interest on the original $100, you're also earning interest on that extra $10. And over time, this snowball effect can lead to some pretty astonishing results.
Yeah, the podcast highlights Warren Buffett as like a prime example of this. They say that 99% of his wealth was accumulated after he turned 50. That's wild. So this whole get rich quick mentality is basically a myth.
Pretty much. Compounding is all about playing the long game. It's about consistency and patience. It's like planting a tree and letting it grow. You wouldn't keep digging it up every day to see how much progress it's made.
No, definitely not. You'd just be disrupting the growth.
Exactly. And it's the same with investing. The more you tinker with your investments, the more you're interrupting that compounding process.
So the takeaway here is like invest consistently and let time do its thing. Don't get spooked by short-term market ups and downs.
Precisely. Ride the waves and trust that in the long run, the power of compounding will work its magic.
Now, this whole idea of long-term and patience, it makes me think about the next topic that the podcast dives into, which is freedom. They argue that the real purpose of money isn't about accumulating stuff, it's about attaining freedom. What are your thoughts on that?
I think that's such a powerful and insightful way to view money.
Right.
Ultimately, most people crave control over their time and their choices.
Yeah.
And money, when used wisely, can be a tool to achieve that freedom. It's not about buying a fancy car or a bigger house. It's about having the flexibility to live life on your own terms.
Yes. It's like they say in the podcast, the real flex isn't a Rolex. It's waking up without an alarm.
Right. How many people dream of not being tied to a 9-to-5 job? Of being able to travel when they want to spend time with loved ones, to pursue their passions without financial constraints. That's the kind of freedom that money can help you achieve.
Totally. It's about having options and the ability to choose how you spend your time, which is ultimately our most valuable resource.
Absolutely. And we're seeing more and more people prioritizing this kind of freedom these days. People are leaving traditional jobs to start their own businesses, work remotely, pursue more flexible careers. It's a real shift in priorities.
Yeah, it's like people are realizing that life is too short to be stuck in a job they hate. Even if it pays well, money is important, but it's a means to an end, not the end itself. And this idea of making choices and focusing on what really matters, it leads us to the final concept that the podcast explores, this idea of tails driving everything. It sounds kind of mysterious, doesn't it?
It does, right? But it's actually a really fascinating concept. So basically the idea is that a few rare extreme events, those tails, have a disproportionate impact on both history and our individual lives.
Okay, so can you give us an example of like what that means in the real world? It still feels a little abstract.
Sure. Think about the stock market.
Yeah.
A handful of companies like Apple, Amazon, Google have driven a huge portion of the market's overall growth. These are the tails. A few big winners often outweigh countless smaller gains and losses.
So it's not about being right all the time. It's about making a few key decisions, those tail events, really well. And that applies to our personal lives too, right?
Absolutely. Think about your career path, who you choose to marry, where you decide to live.
Yeah.
These are all major tail events that can have a ripple effect on your entire life trajectory.
It's like that saying, it's not the hours you put in, but what you put in the hours. A few key decisions can often have the biggest impact. But that also sounds a bit intimidating. Like, what if I miss those key moments or make the wrong choice?
It's true. There's a lot riding on those big decisions. But the podcast reminds us that we don't have to be perfect. It's not about being right all the time. It's about recognizing which decisions are those tail events and giving them the time and attention they deserve.
It's about being mindful and intentional with those big decisions, while not getting too hung up on every little choice we make.
Exactly. And that actually brings us back to the core message of this whole Curious Rays episode. They conclude by saying that managing money is less about IQ and more about habits, mindset, and emotions.
Yeah. It's like we were saying earlier, we often think we're being totally rational with money. But our emotions can really throw us off track.
It's true. We have all these biases and ingrained habits that we might not even be aware of. And they can lead us to make decisions that aren't really in our best interests.
So how do we combat that? How do we become more aware of those hidden influences and make better choices?
Well, the first step is simply acknowledging that these psychological factors exist. Once we're aware of them, we can start to examine our own behaviors and question our assumptions.
Okay, So it's like holding up a mirror to our financial habits and asking, are we really in control here, or are we letting our emotions drive the bus?
Right. And sometimes what we see in that mirror might be uncomfortable. But that discomfort is actually a good thing. It means we're starting to become more conscious and intentional with our money.
And the podcast also emphasizes that true financial success comes from understanding patience risk and knowing when enough is enough.
Yes. It's about having a long-term perspective and not getting caught up in that get-rich-quick mentality. It's about accepting that there will be ups and downs along the way and not letting fear or greed dictate our decisions.
So it's about aligning our financial choices with our values and our goals, and recognizing that true wealth isn't just about money. It's about having freedom, security, peace of mind.
Beautifully said. It's about creating a life of richness and fulfillment in all its dimensions.
Well, on that note, I think we've reached the end of our deep dive. I hope you've enjoyed this exploration of the psychology of money and how our minds can sometimes play tricks on us when it comes to finances.
Yeah, it's been a pleasure joining you for this conversation. I always find it fascinating to kind of delve into these topics and uncover the hidden forces that shape our behavior.
And to our listeners, we encourage you to continue pondering that question that we posed earlier. How might these psychological factors be influencing your financial decisions? What steps can you take today to become more aware of those influences and make choices that lead to greater freedom, security, and joy?
Keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep striving to master not just your money, but your relationship with it. Until next time, happy diving.
See you on our next deep dive.